We'll use a tool called MSF Venom, part of the Metasploit framework, to create a reverse shell. And the way it works as a victim is they just go to their computer and they start a bad program. And once they start a bad program, you will have access to their complete computer. So how does it work? So this is a Ubuntu Linux computer, and obviously it's the victim's computer, and we need the attacker's computer first. So just move it to the side. Then first thing to do is to create the bad application. So we can use a program called MSF Venom for that. So that's installed by default from the Metasploit framework, MSF Venom together. Then there are different executables it can create. It can create executables for Linux, it can create executables for Windows, for Mac. So it supports many different systems for which you can create a reverse shell. So we type MSF Venom -l payloads, and that shows you a list of all the possible executables it can create, and that are really loads of them. So for example, it starts here with Windows, and if you scroll up, so I really have to scroll up a lot, but you'll find other systems, Python, Linux, you also find Mac here, so all kind of systems. I saw Java in there. So Metasploit can create all kind of executables that are like bad executables, so like this one, and once the user clicks that, you will have complete control to the shell of their computer. So the way to do that, let me first, we have a victim is a Linux computer, so let's first list the Linux payloads. So we type MSF Venom -l payloads, we want reverse shell, and we want Linux. So we can run this command to show the Linux payloads. Because the victim's computer is Linux, so we need to create this program, which is a Linux program. So you'll see here many different ones. You can create a interpreter shell. You can create like a default shell for different computer systems. So that's something to keep in mind. So on Linux it runs on many types of computers, like 32 bits, like 64 bits, but also on like completely different processors. So for example, ARM processors or stuff like that. But most computers, at least consumer computers, they are either 32-bit or 64-bit computers. So let's create our executable. We'll need two things. We need the IP address of our server, so the attacker's computer, and we need the port of the server. So those are the information we need. To get the IP address of the server, you can type ip-adder show or ifconfig. So either this or type ifconfig. I like ip-adder show because it's in color. You'll see if you type ifconfig, it shows the IP address here. If you type ip-adder show, it shows your IP address here. So now we know the IP address of our attacking computer, so it will connect to our server. The ports of the server is anything between 1 and 65,535. So you can pick any port. For example, I'll type 4444 as a port. It doesn't really matter. You can pick any number between 1 and that large number, 65,000 roughly. And next we'll create the executable. So we type MSF Venom space -p with the payload. So the payload that we selected, we want the interpreter shell, reverse shell, and it has to be a 32-bit Linux computer. Then space -l host with your IP and port. So Linux, first we type the payload we want. Then we type the IP address. We type the port. And then the format, it's also important to the type of executable you want to create. If you have Windows, there's .exe. If you have Mac, there's .dmg. And on Linux, there's .elf. So elf and then we type bat.elf, or whatever you want to name your program, right? So bat.elf is pretty obvious. This is just a file name, the final part. Press enter. That will create the bat executable. So it might take a moment. And next you want to transfer that bat executable. So it has just created it, bat.elf. You want to transfer that executable to the victim's computer. So that might be through a USB disk, you might email it, you might send a link for them to download. There's different ways that they could run this executable on their computer. And of course it's a reverse shell, so it will connect to our server, and we need to set up a server to be listening. In order to do that, we type msf console -q. So that takes a moment to load. Then once it's loaded, we specify that we want to use the exploit handler. Then we need to define the payload, the port of our server, the IP address of our server, and type run. So the payload we want is of course the same payload, so that's this payload. Paste it in. Then the IP address of our server, so that's the lhost space with our IP address. So the IP address will be different on your computer, of course. Then the port that you chose, so the port you chose before has to be the same as the port you're listening on to now, because it will try to connect to the IP and ports you specified before. So if you would change it now, it won't work. You have to use the same IP address and port, so your service IP and ports. So I chose the port 4444 and then type run. So now it's listening. It's just waiting for the computer for the victim to run this program. So if the victim starts the program, you have complete access to their computer through the command line. So I can type, for example, the ls command, and it shows you the contents of their home directory. You'll see the executable here. I can type who am I, and sorry, that command didn't work. But you can type different commands. If I type question mark, you can see different commands. So there's all kind of things you can do here. Basic commands like read file, list the files in the directory, download a file, you can upload a file, we can search for files, we can basically control the computer. You can also do some funny things like open a webcam chat or open the microphone, all kind of things like with audio, video, some system commands, so you can kill programs or you can drop into a shell.